Egypt or rural Tunisia, what does he want most? Does he want social justice? Does he want dignity? What gives him the most freedom? Ultimately, it's the bread, ladies and gentlemen, because the bread allows him to keep on living. The bread allows him to go and get the things like social justice and like dignity. He can get those later. But ultimately, he needs that groundwork. He needs that groundwork. He needs the sustenance. He needs the economic development to achieve all those things, right? For that man, for that individual, the freedom provided by a simple loaf of bread is far greater than any democratic freedoms which can be provided by prioritizing democratic development, right? So on those points, we think that ultimately, if you're talking about a clash between these two ideas, and we don't think they are mutually exclusive, but we think there might be sometimes could be clashes, we think if we're talking about that, the economy always comes first, because it provides more and real, tangible freedoms to people in these countries. But on to the actual kind of the core points which we brought to this, right? Like, I think there were some points which were brought up, and this will be my rebuttal. Shurishti, for example, talked about the LGBT rights and development of social rights and how it can help the economy. We think if that is the case, we think that they wouldn't necessarily be mutually exclusive from our model, right? Because our model prioritizes economic development. If we think that the economic development that can be gained from liberalizing the rules allowing women to work in some of these nations can help the economy, we're all for it, right? Or if, for example, we talked about corruption on the opposition as well. We think corruption is a problem in authoritarian regimes, but equally it is a problem in transitionary and democratic regimes. And similarly, democratic regimes aren't necessarily more stable or attract more investment, right? Democratic transitionary regimes with a short period or short history of democracy are actually incredibly unstable. And actually, investors look for a stable regime. It's why China is an incredibly successful country at drawing in foreign investment. Not because it's democratic or because people like them particularly, but because they provide a stable economic prioritization which investors find attractive. But on our side of the house, we talked about this idea that you can gain dependence on the state. You gain, if you prioritize political development first, you can get effectively bribery of the electorate. You can have the government saying, you are starving, we can give you welfare, vote for us, which does not foster democratic engagement or democratic, an eventual democratic society, right? Secondly, we think also this idea of democracy takes time to achieve. In that time to achieve, people can die. People can starve if you do not prioritize economic development over that, right? But also, I think this is one of the key points to our speech, and that is, if you, as an individual within Tunisia, Egypt, or any of these countries we're talking about, feel any desire to engage with the political process, it has to be because the political process gives you something. And ultimately, if a political process gives you the right to a job, but there are no jobs available for you to have, it probably makes more sense to have that job rather than the right to a job, right? So ultimately, if we can provide those things first, we think it is far more beneficial overall. For all these reasons, we beg to propose this case. Thank you.
Thank you very much to the government, and now the summary for the opposition will be provided by Rahaf Mohammed from Jordan. Thank you very much.
So, ladies and gentlemen, here is the case. We, Arab Spring countries, have been suffering from our regimes for more than 30 years, and we finally spoke up 2 years ago. The revolution is not over yet. We've been suffering from our regimes that were suffocating us, from our regimes that were not listening to what we need, whether we need economic reform, political reform, social reform, education reform. This is how we started. We started because we wanted to speak up, because we wanted our unstable, our corrupted governments to hear what our needs are. Let's go back to the idea of the economic reform and the political reform and the democratic and norms and institutions. Yes, we want to go for the economic reform. But how are we going to go for the economic reform without setting a structured and a clear closure for the first revolution that we once started? Are we going to start another revolution for our economic demands without setting a closure for our previous freedom revolution? It will not take place. let's take for example what happened in Egypt lately. When, yes, Morsi was elected, and most of people in Egypt wanted him. They practiced their democracy. But what happened is Morsi put the constitution to the fact that he wanted to govern everything and he wanted to take over everything in Egypt. And we got stuck in the patriarchal society that we are suffering from, and that it was suffocating us 30 years ago with Ben Ali, with Hosni Mubarak, with Gaddafi. We don't want this. Arab countries doesn't need patriarchal thinking anymore. How are we going to do this? Yes, we need to open a tolerant debate, a tolerant environment, admitting and accepting women's rights, minorities, and any individual right to be a different person. Let's take, for example, or imagine, yes, we have 40% of poverty in Egypt. But if we have women and men working together hand by hand, will there be the same poverty? No. The economic reform will be resolved easier and faster once admitting that women are able, that women can have the ability to change as the man is. It's not only about men, actually. Women can do anything. You talk that people might starve, might eat, might die from starving. No. Arab countries have a lot of resources. We have oil, we have the Nile, we have everything. Women in Jordan and other countries are being killed because of honor crimes, and this is not acceptable. The worth of life has nothing to do with bread. It has nothing to do with bread. When we talked about Taiwan, Singapore, China, yes, these countries are dictatorial countries, but such an economic reform will never take place when the people are against it. All Chinese people, Singapore people, Taiwan people wanted a reform. And this is, again, not an economic reform. Yes, it went for the economic path, but it never happened without the will and without the cooperation of women, of their people. No change will take place without people's will. Governments are there to do the thing for us and to make such a good environment for its people. Dependence, economic dependency, yes, we are economically dependent countries. But I don't think the problem will be solved if we went for the economic reform. We want to be free. We want to be free from all the regimes, from patriarchy, from all the ideas, from all the challenges that are facing us. And then we're going to go and solve our dependency issues economically with outside countries. We cannot start any other revolution without setting a clear and a structured closure for the revolution that we started. I appreciate the fact that the proposition is with the idea of economic reform, but this idea is also revolutionary. And what I want them to do is to take a deep breath. To take a deep breath, we need to set ourselves free from everything. And then we'll go for the economic reform, step by step. But this step cannot be taken without finishing the first step that we once started. For that we oppose, and for that I want to say that freedom and democracy is the thing that makes us alive. Freedom is the thing that makes us want to be here and in everywhere, not bread. It's freedom. Thank you very much.
Government and a member of the opposition. I think at this point I have to call again for a vote. And remind you about what is the motion. This House believes that states in transition should prioritize economic development over the promotion of democratic norms and institutions. Let's vote again. Hands up for those who are in favor of this motion. Now, still the minority, and who is against? Counter vote. and it's still the majority, so I don't think things changed dramatically, just a tiny bit, a couple of people more. I've been convinced by the government. Well, let's open the Q&A session. I think we have a facilitator for the Q&A session with Stephen Nolan.
Well, Stephen unfortunately can't be here today.
So you will be facilitating.
Yes, that falls to me.
Yeah.
For those of you who know Stephen, I can assure you I'm not going to be attempting an Irish accent. So let's open the discussion. Who has questions? I would point out before we go on that all of these individuals are trained debaters. They've been trained on various programs, be that Young Arab Voices in Jordan or Morocco, or any of the other training events, or the training events that are run by the University of London. So they don't necessarily believe or support the views that they're arguing in favour of. So when you ask them questions, they will kind of give you responses that might not support the line of argument they've been following during their speeches. They're much more reflective of their own beliefs. So if we could continue, simply open the floor to anyone who has questions. Okay, Robert.
For prop side, could you give some specific instances in the past or in the foreseeable future, instances or issues in which there is this decision to be made between economic or social justice, freedom, etc. That's one thing that I've
Well, generally,
Yeah.
Okay, so we'll give prop side a chance to respond. We've also got a response from Rahaf on ops. So
Does it work?
yep. So if you guys want to start.
generally, one thing that is not sort of common knowledge is that some of the Asian countries, like the Asian tigers that have built up their economies, were very autocratically run at certain periods. Korea, South Korea, which is sort of now very democratic and socially aware society, started off as literally a military dictatorship that dictated the economy and which industries they're going to build up, which industries they're going to protect, with civil liberties taking sometimes a big backseat. Generally, China is used as an example, but although the example is more in the context that they were terrified of sudden reform given to what has happened to the Soviet Union. So we never really could have known whether China could have had both democracy and economic development at the same time, or could have that the economic development have been more humane rather than the system that they've had, the central planning one that moves massive amounts of people from place to place. But
I mean, I also think there is an issue in terms of like resource allocation because like if we talk about economic capital and political capital, there's an opportunity cost when you go for any particular like line of development, right? So if you have a limited amount of resources, for example, to spend on government programs, if you prioritize, for example, spending on development of new democratic institutions or the reform of democratic institutions, perhaps at the expense of subsidies for farming or something else like that, there's an opportunity cost lost there. So you do have this issue of prioritizing where your money goes, but also political capital. Like there is a finite number of people who can work at certain levels, like expertise, for example, political expertise. Where you direct those people can also have this opportunity cost. Like if you put all these people onto developing democratic institutions, they may not be able to do other work which could potentially help economic development. I think that's what I meant. I was trying to get at when I was talking about the clash between different things. It's not necessarily a clear-cut clash, but like there is this loss of opportunity.
Sorry, just fast to interject, a good example that I just remembered might be my home country of Serbia, which has a very volatile political life. It has a multi-party system. We tend to have elections more often than the constitution prescribes. And it has this sort of like every government has a very short-term view in terms of how the economy should grow. Because for the foreseeable future, they have no idea if they're going to stay in power, or especially since very rarely do you have like government majority. So in those terms, we have abundance of democracy, but it has sort of like more work to paralyze economic progress than sort of instigate it. That doesn't necessarily mean it would have been better if we had like a central planning body, but that would kind of be the more obvious way in which too much political discourse sort of like grinds the country to a halt.
Okay.
Did you want to weigh in on this? Okay.
Yeah. Um, Good evening again. I just wanted to make it clear. When you asked the question, did you mean the Arab countries actually, the Arab countries and their future? Actually, I came from Jordan, and last 2 weeks faced a lot of protests according to what the government is doing with the economy of the country. The thing is that before coming here, I stayed with for like 4 hours with an economist in Jordan, and he's a very well-known economist, and he told us that the future of a country like Jordan won't be resolved this easily because we are still stuck in a lot of other policies outside Jordan. One. Two, the thing is that we don't have a transparent government. Every now and then, we have a new government that is corrupted more than the previous one, which is taking us to a vague situation. We do not know what are we going to face in the future, but nothing tells that there is going to be good news in the future actually, because still we need our people, Jordanian people, to vote for a transparent and a good government that will clean the whole corruption that was for years and years and years, so that we can have a good economic reform later on. But this won't take place unless we have a good government.
Sushni, did you?
Yeah, this is not directly in response to anything that either Rahaf, James, or Victor have said, but I think one of the issues here is that the only way in which you can justify the op case is to sort of posit these theoretical benefits of democracy, right? I mean, you have to sort of presume that democracy in and of itself, because of its nature, will actually promote lesser corruption or greater accountability. So I'm not really sure how plausible it might be to look for real world examples uh, with specific regard to this debate, in the sense that, I mean, if you are talking about hypothetical scenarios, the best you can do is to say, we think if there is democracy in these countries, uh, some of these other things might not happen. So, I mean, I think that's another thing to keep in mind, that, sometimes we sort of think democracy is really good, but it not always is, or at least it's not a perfect system anyway. And it's, and possibly economic benefits are more tangible than the establishment of democratic norms, I suppose.
Anything more from our panel on Rob's question? Right. Let's move to other questions. Jess?
I can't hear. I can't hear the
you.
question.
Well, here's the thing. There's this school of thought that sort of tries to vindicate the Chinese policy that has been towards government planning for sustained growth. In terms, one, you have the problem that you've noticed is that, okay, so people are getting everything they need from the government. Therefore, the Chinese party will probably stay in power for decades in advance, and this will also follow all the disenfranchisements on human rights that come with the party. However, what some people argue is that just because the party has been so successful in creating wealth that is somewhat being dispersed now, you have a very strong Chinese middle class, somewhere around 200 to 300 million middle class Chinese. They are now the ones that have vested interests in how the government is being run, how business is easy to maintain. They are very interested into seeing who is going to be elected. And the idea goes that because of this now new created middle class, they are the ones who are going to push for more democracy. That, on the other hand, it's also problematic because that's like a future theory that might happen. It sounds like it makes sense because, like, if we look at civil liberties revolutions in Europe, usually they were delivered by the bourgeoisie, people who sort of like got rich. Whether this is going to happen, we don't know. It's a theory that makes sense. On the other hand, I think when it comes to countries such as Egypt, I think the proposition has sort of like misrepresented the idea of bread. I think that simply based on the United States military assistance, if it could be diverted into bread production, the problem will probably be solved. Because the thing, what both Mubarak did, what Sadat did, everybody, they did exactly what the Chinese are doing. They said, I'll lead you to economic progress. I'll give you the hospitals. I'll give you the schools. I'll give you the wonderful roads, etc. You just have to, you just have to you just have to reconcile with the fact that you're not going to vote. Which unfortunately doesn't mean not just having votes, it means not being able to lobby for human rights, not being able to lobby for more male to female equality, many other things that follow. So what one theory says, because of this economic development, the new middle class is now successfully fighting for human rights. Where on the other hand, we've seen that like Egypt, even though it had economic growth, it only benefited the minority in power, and in fact was sort of like the carrot that kept perpetuating the autocracy. So the short answer is no idea.
I also think that just in terms of what Victor said about the development of the middle class, and also about the development of democracy as a whole, if you look at Western nations and what we consider to be very strong democratic countries, like the UK, for example, the process of democratization, it took an incredibly long time. And also, but the process of industrialization happened during a period of our history when we were fairly autocratic in our tendencies. We weren't particularly democratic until fairly recently in our history. So I think there's kind of this expectation that in these transitionary countries, you can become a fully democratic and a good democracy in a very short period of time, when it takes a very long time, and as Victor was talking about in the speech, to internalize the sorts of views and opinions which each individual within a democracy is required to have. And I think that having a stake in the country, if that stake is economic wealth, I think that can be quite useful. But also I think in terms of the context of the debate, because we're talking about transitionary countries, we're probably not talking about extreme examples like China, because obviously China is not transitioning particularly towards democracy, or if it is, it's doing it incredibly slowly. If we're talking about countries such as in North Africa, such as Tunisia and Egypt, they are moving towards democratic, away from authoritarian towards democratic systems. If we're talking about it in that context, you could say that perhaps they might be slightly more authoritarian than they would have been if they'd prioritized democracy, but they're still not going to be purely authoritarian. They're not going to necessarily go back to how they were. At least that's how I view it. But
Yeah, I want to add something about the Egyptian case. People's needs are not being fulfilled yet, so they misunderstand democracy. The government are convincing us that this is democracy. There are transparent elections, yes. We voted for Morsi, yes. Majority of Egypt voted for Morsi, not for the sake of democracy, and he represents us. You didn't see the governments, the different governments in Egypt who have marginalized places. They go to them and they gave them food so that they could vote for them. So if we could not start and talk about democracy because people are not aware of what democracy is.
Actually, I have to oppose. I'm sorry.
I was going to.
I'm sorry. As
Okay.
far as we are talking about Egypt, I'm sorry, Mona. I'm Egyptian
Okay,
too. But maybe I have a
wanted to talk
different.
about the same idea.
Maybe I have a different view. All regimes keep saying that we are not ready for democracy and people are not ready for democracy. Okay, I think at some point we should start getting ready for democracy. And we can't just keep saying that and keep convincing people that you are poor, you are not well educated, you can't decide for yourself, so we are going to decide for you, and it's not for you to take bread and to take just your main needs, and you don't have to say anything anymore. As long as you are eating, sleeping, having shelter. No, no. We have to start at some point. I know that maybe people made mistake when they choose Morsi, or maybe they do not. But they should try. They should be given the chance to make mistakes, to learn from their mistakes, to be able to say, okay, we voted for Morsi now because we thought so and so and so, but it turns out to be a wrong choice. Next time, I'm going to look for so and so and so in his program, or in. We need to learn. We can't just say, and we are not ready for democracy. So when we are going to be ready for democracy? Thank you.
Okay, Mona, I have to speak before.
We'll have a really quick contribution from
Yes.
Ralph, and then we'll move back to Mona.
Okay, I just wanted to say that Morsi did not win the election with an 80% of the people voting for him. 51% is not the majority of people in Egypt. 51% tells that half of people wanted Morsi with another few 1%, and the 49% did not want Morsi. So not all Egypt wants Morsi.
49% of those who voted.
Who voted? Not the whole nation of Egypt voted, actually.
Yes.
The other thing I wanted to say is, actually, I forgot it. Okay, Muna, you can take the
Okay,
floor.
I didn't say
I
that
just forgot.
people are not ready for democracy. I just said that people misunderstand democracy. Now they have the chance. You're talking about the chance, to give them the chance.
Yes.
They had the chance to represent their president, and they had the chance to represent the people in the parliament.
No, they are expected to do mistakes at the beginning.
Yes, I didn't say anything
To
about
learn,
it.
yani,
Yes,
this
yes,
is a learning
exactly.
process.
But-
This is actually a common misconception in all former communist countries. There are people who are like, okay, we're now a democratic society. Where's my living standard? Without really understanding
What is democracy?
that those things necessarily don't go always hand in hand or at the same pace.
Okay. I'm gonna have to disappoint you, Rahaf, because we've got people have been indicated to
Yes.
before. So we'll go with Abdul first.
I've
Then
got,
we'll go to David at the back.
I've got a question for the proposition. So first of all, congratulations, you won.
Yeah.
But I'm still not convinced.
Yes.
You said
You mean possession?
the revolution happened because of the will of the people. But don't you think it's a bit naive if we take the example of Egypt? Mubarak is not in power anymore because the United States refused to support him. And there are a lot in the United States who said if it was George Bush, he would still be in power. You
I
also
don't
take the
think so.
example of Libya, and you say this is the will of the people. But without the bomb from the OTAN, I think Gaddafi will still be in power. And then you said democracy has to come first because you follow the lead of the West. But when you look at them, they didn't do as you suggest. They didn't put democracy when they had their own economic revolution. If you take the UK Industrial Revolution 1850, children were working. That is not a lot about human rights. If you take the United States, there was still slavery. So I still believe that, as Marx says, this is a materialist society. What comes first is economy, and politics is just a subject of economy.
Do you want to take that? Or should I?
I have one point best to answer is yeah, just, and I leave the rest for my colleagues. When you said that if the United States wasn't in favor, wasn't in favor of Hosni Mubarak, he would have been still ruling. I think something like that. And then the United States is the reason why Hosni Mubarak is not ruling
Conspiracy.
now. You think so?
Strongly, I believe
يعني I believe I believe no it's okay, but this is what I think. Maybe I'm wrong, but I think that at the beginning يعني let's agree that the United States won't take any decisions without really considering the consequences. So at the beginning they were just watching the scene and seeing what it will end or how it will end. And when they see that people really, really are not in favor of Hosni Mubarak anymore, and that he cannot contaminate the revolution or like kill the revolution, they start to change their, their stand. They want to appear like we are defending human rights, we are going with the people, yay, you go. But few months before the revolution, Hosni Mubarak was the strategic, ally with United States. So this change in situation is not because of the United States, because of the people of Egypt.
And if I could sort of, okay, sorry, go ahead.
You speak.
Okay. You can go
Okay,
ahead.
me? Okay, I just wanted to tell you that the revolution did not start in Egypt. It started by Bouazizi burning himself. And it's a different story. It's not the conspiracy theory that you're talking about. Yes, I kind of believe of the conspiracy theory, but not to the extent that it's all about what America wants. I don't believe that. I believe that, yes, to some extent there is a game between America, Israel, and other forces, but still, we are not gonna give up whether this is the game of America. It's not this way, and this is not gonna stay. What I wanted to say a minute ago is that we waited for 30 years, people, and we're not gonna change in 2 years. It's not the solution. We're not in a magical world. We waited for 30 years. I agree that we might take 7 years, maybe to 10 years, to set the right decision and to choose. The French Revolution took a lot. It did not take a day and night. And we're not supposed to be the best countries in 2 years. We cannot. The thing is not this way. The other thing that I wanted to tell you is, yes, when people started to believe that they have the will and the ability to change, everything will be different. I work in one of the most underprivileged areas in Jordan. And women are the ones who are leading this place. They are starting campaigns, a campaign for reading, a campaign for abuse, a campaign for everything. And they are able to do a lot of things. Not their men, the women. And yes, I believe, I actually forgot to say it, I believe that if women are involved in such a thing, in such a reform, then the thing will be resolved faster in 20 times rather getting only men involved. Sorry, I believe that freedom is the solution.
We'll take a response to that question from Victor, and then we'll move on to the question at the back. I've got one more here. So, Victor.
Okay, I would just quickly want to discuss about something else you pointed out. You've sort of noticed that generally democratic development and economic development don't necessarily follow the same timeline. In fact, economic development usually preceded European political development. In fact, when it comes to child labor laws, and especially when it comes to women's position in society, that probably would not have changed hadn't we had the First and the Second World War, where we had like the ability of women the chance for women to show that they're not too delicate for factory work. In fact, that they can do it sometimes better than men. I say sometimes because I really don't feel like saying always. But the thing is, if we look at Egyptian economy, and if we look at the way Egypt works, probably economic change is going to happen in the next 20 to 30 years. Now, that might be maybe a rough estimate, but a society that has been built up on state dependency, in terms that you have to be very close with the state, that you have to be very in good terms with the state in order to advance economically, is a system that is very very hard to dismantle. So in those terms, I don't see any reason why you couldn't have, this process and immediate more democratization of a country, because as the opposition has said, this is actually might be more tangible than economic development. It's like the opposition says it's like really, well, it's like closure to the revolution. Okay, economy is going to take us a very long time, but at least we change our government every 4 years. This is something tangible. And that doesn't necessarily mean that this government now knows, okay, if we want a second term, we need to continue the reform that has started. So if I could argue it like in those terms, we already had a question, but we really still have no proof that you can have democracy and then economic growth, even though historically it was usually economic growth that follows democracy. But I really I can't think of a strong example that says that this cannot happen by any means.
We'll move to a question from right at the back, and then one straight here.
It seems that when countries democratize, it naturally, obviously, gives a voice to more people. But this tends to create sort of distributional conflicts, okay? As different groups of people want things from the state, which they've never been able to get before. So it opens up desires from different regions or different groups for help from the state. Surely the problem is where the state cannot provide all these goods to all these areas at once. It creates conflict between these areas or groups. And this can, at its worst, suggest that democracy cannot, rather than just isn't, meeting the people's expectations. And this can tend to discredit the idea of democracy as a whole. Like, as Victor seemed to suggest, like, you look at the example of Russia in particular, where the experience of the 1990s and the economic collapse of the 1990s completely discredited the idea of democracy for many people, many Russians, and led to what seems to be a fairly long-term move away from democracy, which won't necessarily be permanent, but does it not seem that where you do not have at least a solid amount of economic growth, it makes it much harder for democracy to put down roots, and much easier for democracy to be established, perhaps. But if it's established and then rejected, I think that's worse than it never being established in the first place.
Throw that open to the whole panel.
I don't know the question. What kind of question?
I don't know, but yeah.
Now that would be the main question. Would you rather risk a new fledgling democracy that might deject people, or would you rather wait for a period of time where you're pretty much sure that democracy is going to work? I think any new democracy is going to face exactly the things that you've mentioned. That people are going to say, okay, now we're in a democracy. I voted, God damn it. I want this. I want that. I want all these things. And usually it's going to be a massive shock to people that these things just don't fall off trees. I think one of a good example is there's a very good catchphrase that says, when Russians got democracy, the first thing they thought, oh my God, we're going to have to work a lot. When this happened in former Yugoslav states, the consensus was, cool, now we don't have to work as hard. Now, Russia is a very good example of people being indeed disillusioned by the insecurity of democracy, although there are other factors, such as people playing with free market, etc. But here's the thing. Putin hasn't been able to slam the door shut. I don't think he'll ever be able to acquire as much power as his predecessors have had. He still has to tolerate some democratic institutions that have crept in through the cracks. So it kind of gives, I would say, maybe more hope in the future that people are going to start learning how to poke holes into United Russia Party and see that it is not so powerful as the Communist Party was. Now, that would, depending on, I really can't say, none of us really knows what the mindset of the average Russian is. Do they feel like, yes, thank God Putin finally put a stop to this democracy nonsense? Or is it that people are now realizing that even though we have, again, this gigantic party, now we have more say into how the gigantic party is being run. So in terms of putting a foot in the door, I personally say you can never close that door again shut, bar something really drastic happening like World War III, hopefully not ever. But I would say, yes, people will be disillusioned by democracy, pretty much every country, but I don't think they'll ever be so disillusioned that they'll revert to the old times.
Do we have any?
I mean, just like a quick note to that. I mean, see, the converse of what you're saying would be to presume that if a country sort of had reached a degree of economic stability, for instance, it would automatically predispose that nation towards democracy. And that, I think, is an equally hypothetical assumption to make. I mean, for instance, when Keris raised that question, I mean, one can just as plausibly imagine a model where, because you have this degree of economic stability, you might in fact think, well, what do we need democracy for? So I mean, if you are, if one is sort of just presuming that democracy is the natural and the good thing to have, you know, for states, I don't see how it works one or the other way, right? Because I mean, if you talk about how any fledgling democratic movement towards democracy will, you know, might completely get shattered because people are beginning to see how, oh well, you know, none of our needs are being met. What's the point of democracy at all? But equally likely, you could have the other situation where you say, well, you know, all of our needs are apparently being met, so why do we need democracy at all? You know, I think it's just.
I think I have one word. Actually, in Egypt, we are facing this situation now, and after people get to know what democracy means, they start like, oh, I want this and I want that, and they don't sit and talk in a constructive way. They just shout at each other, just because I think they are young in democracy. They don't know the real meaning of democracy. They need time. Any country needs time to learn how to establish a well-democratic system. They will need time. And when I think when people learn the real meaning of democracy, they will not let it go. They will not.
We're not letting it go.
You mentioned that only 51% of the population voted. So surely these transitional Arab countries need to focus on rallying everybody within the society to vote. Because if the vote isn't fully representative of society, then how do you create democracy?
Okay, this also needs time because people, mainly in Arab Spring countries, have been denied their rights to really express themselves and say what they really want. Elections was just a privilege. People don't go to vote because they know that either whether they vote for this person or that person, what already been decided will be done, whatever they think. So they are not encouraged to get engaged in the political process. So again, it needs time to build trust between governments and people. It needs time for people to feel that, oh, really, when I go to vote, really something changes, that my voice really matters. This needs time. So I don't think that in the last election we had in Egypt, there was no, not a lot of people go to vote. Some of people were, nothing will happen. This is just waste of time. We will not change. And the other part of people simply don't care. They only care about bread. They only care about going to work and support their families. So it really needs time for people to feel that they need to go and vote for the president or in parliament.
I mean, in any case, you can't increase political engagement by actually putting democracy in the backseat.
Yes.
Yeah.
I also have something to say.
You want to start first?
I mean, if you don't mind.
No.
Oh well. No, I think one of the issues, and I think this is kind of coming back to our arguments about like economic growth. I think ultimately you're saying that a lot of people don't vote because they are engaged in what they perceive to be the more important activity of feeding their family, which is obviously on them. Like, a lot of people should prioritise that, right? I think historically, one of Richard's arguments, and just as a historical fact, points to the fact that when you have the development of economic growth and you get the development of the middle class, because the middle class is in effect comfortable with its economic status and isn't reliant, like isn't, for example, working from every paycheck to paycheck, or it's stable in where it is, and it knows that it won't necessarily starve if for example, they lose their job. I think what that means is that once you've got that level of stability, you then feel that you can then engage in the next level of right. You become interested in, because you take your economic status for granted, you then become interested in what you can receive next from the government. I think that's when you get higher levels of political engagement. I also think it's important to remember that even in the developed democracies such as our own, we get very low political turnout. I think in Britain it was 60% or potentially less in the last elections. I can't remember exactly. I mean, even in the best developed democracies in the world, not that ours is, but like in other places, you still get very low turnouts. And I think it's just a problem that democracies will always face, that you will have a significant portion of the population who's just disengaged or uninterested. Alex.
Mona, just to add something to Dalia's speech. When she mentioned that what matters to people is bread and food, yes, this is the case. We should first move people from the phase of concern about bread and food to the phase of concerning about democracy and elections. So this is just.
But we think that economic reforms and political reforms should go hand in hand. That's what I think, especially in countries in transition. None of these two reforms should be denied for the time being. They should go hand in hand, because when people get engaged in the political life and the political reform process, I think this will boost the economic reform process.
Excellent. Well, we are on schedule now. So that, I think, wraps up the question and answer session. We'll move now to our reception, so you'll have lots more opportunities to speak with the panel, to ask them all of the questions I'm sure you're still burning to ask them. Leaves only for me to hand back over to Richard. Thank you all very much for your questions.
If I could just briefly thank Alexander very much for facilitating that. If I could thank Leela very much for moderating, and especially if I could thank our speakers for their fantastic performances this evening. Thank you. We're here for another hour or so, so please do stay. Please do enjoy the refreshments and enjoy talking to everybody. Thanks a lot.